Hey, this is Jacob Evan. Thanks for tuning in. As I mentioned in a previous video, we've been doing a regular Shabbat online meeting. We have a TorahCentric group that we've started, and that has been going well. And what we've been doing is just reading through the Torah portion, just the traditional reading of the day, reading through it beforehand, and then talking about it in sequence. And one thing that I like to do is I like to give the opportunity to cover everything that goes on in the passage. It really kind of bothered me whenever I would go to congregations in the past and they would highlight maybe one tiny little portion and want us to focus on that, and then what I was interested in ended up being something that they wanted to just bypass. And so that's what we've been doing. We've been looking through all of it. We've been reading it beforehand and then discussing and giving thoughts or questions on what we read as a result. And I wanted to give kind of a partial recap of what's been going on because this is something that someone requested, and I didn't want to actually be recording the event itself, partially because I didn't want to be risking doing a deed or making a work on that day. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a few different topics which came up in our discussions over the past 2 weeks. This is certainly not an exhaustive look at any of these individual topics. It's just an overview of some things that we looked at. And those topics are going to include leprosy and the leper, or what is translated as leprosy at least, and also the leprosy of the house, the crimson or the scarlet, which is used in the rituals, and the scapegoat or the Azazel, and whether there is a connection with Leviticus 17 with the seirim that are described there, or seirim, depending on how it's spelled. The word which is sometimes translated as demons. One of the obvious questions that comes up with regard to the leper or the metsorah is, what exactly is this condition that's being described? What specifically is it? Because we know the traditional translation is leprosy and leper, but is that really what's going on? And as far as my reading is concerned, most of the scholarly opinions tend to suggest it's not leprosy. That tends to be the predominant view, that it's not actually what we would call medically as leprosy today. And so the question is, well, what is it? And there are suggestions that maybe it's a set of conditions, not just one, but a set of different types of skin conditions. Maybe it's vitiligo, maybe it's something else. And one of the discussions that we had was whether this could be maybe a unique disease, a disease which is not one of the ones that are being kept from the people as described elsewhere in the Torah, but maybe this is a sort of unique, separate disease, one which is maybe used for a purpose. And that is something we considered because there is a clear example of this in the Torah with Moses' sister, with Miriam, and she was afflicted with it after she said negative things about Moses and about Moses being chosen. And one of the ideas floated on this was, well, there are certainly commands in the Torah where it's not always obvious to the outside whether a person has violated it or not, like hating someone in your heart, hating your brother in your heart. That's not necessarily going to be clear to the public in the ways that other command violations might be. And so one suggestion was, could this be a supernatural punishment that's being inflicted upon people for violating commands? And of course, that could be a possibility. It's not explicit in that way. There was a suggestion that maybe the word itself could be referring to one who's speaking evil, and in my research of the word, it is possible to maybe extract that, although from what I see, the most clear meaning appears to be that it is some type of skin disease, and that it appears across other Semitic languages that there are similar words used referring to some type of disease or some type of condition which is being described here as well. And so my inclination on it, although that would be a possibility that it could be used as some type of punishment or some type of test in some way. I also think it is plausible that it is more broad than just being a special disease inflicted upon Israel, and that's just my take on it. And then in regard to the leprosy of the house, which is something which shows up later in Leviticus 14, the ritual surrounding what if it is found in the house, and of course this might be described or seen as a mold or something like that today. And there are a few things which I think are interesting about this passage, one being that it says explicitly that Elohim is placing it there. It says explicitly, and I am giving, and then it refers to this condition in the house of the land of your holding. The way that it is framed in the Torah is that he is doing it. So that's one aspect of it. And so we started thinking about this and what could be the purpose, what might be a purpose behind it in some cases at least. And one thought that came up was that this is another situation that the public may not really be aware of. That a person could have something like this going on in their house and cover it up or otherwise keep it a private matter because it's kind of a huge ordeal. It's definitely inconvenient to follow this command in the case that it applies. And so one thought that came up was, what if this could be a test at times? What if this could be a test to see, is the person just going to go with what's convenient and kind of cover it up? Or is the person going to expose themselves to what might be a major ordeal for the sake of following the command? And another aspect of this, which I find to be interesting, the possible implications of it, is in regard to verse 36, because it's talking about how the priest is going to command them to clear out that house because he is essentially the one which is determining whether it's unclean, and whenever he does that, that is causing the contents of the house to be unclean. And so I find that to be curious because one might assume that it either is unclean and therefore everything in it is already unclean, or it's not, but that's not actually how it's framed in the text. And backing up a bit to earlier in the chapter, we also talked a little bit about the ritual itself, the ritual for the person who is being cleansed or cleansing himself, the ritual and how he's taking 2 clean birds, and we talked about the cedar wood, how that's maybe cedar or fir, and we also considered briefly the scarlet or the crimson material which was used. And one thing that I have observed about this, of course, a long time ago I had heard about how red dyes are sometimes used in food even today, which are derived from insects or derived from invertebrates, carmine or carmine, and this is also apparently certified by certain kosher agencies despite that fact. Certain agencies which are not recommended, as it might be put. And so I had been aware of the fact that insects and vertebrates are sometimes used for red dyes, and I had also a long time ago heard about this idea about using the sea snail or using mollusks for the blue, which is used in the tabernacle and the priestly garments and in the thread which appears in the commanded tassels. And initially, whenever I heard that years ago, I just kind of dismissed it outright because I thought, oh, that doesn't make any sense. That would be unclean, so that can't be right. And so I just dismissed it and didn't really look into it back then. And now, with regard to the crimson and the scarlet, and this is something which in Leviticus 14:4, it doesn't just appear in reference to this ritual. The material is also used in reference to the priestly garments. It's also used in the tent of meeting being the commanded holy structure of the Torah. The structure which the rituals, many of the sacrifices explicitly say they're supposed to be done at the tent of meeting. And something which I have recognized about the Hebrew wording behind this word translated as scarlet or crimson, is that there is an indication that it's probably made from insect or invertebrate derived dyes. And that would be consistent with certain other red fabrics which have existed throughout history. And in fact, that is sometimes considered a royal dye, that red dye derived from certain insects. And as odd as that all may sound, the reason why I think that's a possibility is because of the Hebrew wording. One of the words being in Leviticus 14:4, tola'at, which one might note that this same word appears in Deuteronomy 28:39 as some type of crop pest. And it also shows up a similar form of the word in Exodus 16:20 when it's talking about the manna, the mon, rotting and raising worms. And even to this day, the word is used, as far as I understand it, the word is used in reference to produce which is infested. There's the recommendation whenever you're looking at Jewish recommendations on produce and upon what to use, what not to use, they'll often talk about tolah. And as odd as that may sound, that could be very relevant as far as how we're understanding the manufacture of this material because of the Hebrew wording that is used. And this last week, we also looked at the ritual for the Day of Atonement, the Day of Covering, the once-a-year ritual where Aaron is going and both performing certain sacrifices and doing certain other rituals in combination with that. And this is said to cover over all of the sins of the community. And like many of the rituals, it's said to be forever. It's said to be olam. Of course, olam doesn't exactly mean forever, but if you look at my study about it previously, I go into this in detail and talk about how effectively it is used for forever. And in support of that, of course, we have Deuteronomy 18:1-5, where it talks about the Levites being chosen forever, chosen to minister forever, all for all of the days, literally. And one of the things we looked at with this ritual is what is translated as scapegoat, or departing goat, the word Azazel. And there are a few different ideas that surround this, a few different ideas as to what is referring to. And it is possible to parse the word into referring to a goat and referring to departing or referring to removing. And so it would be the goat which is removed, the goat which is departing. That is certainly a way to look at this. And in addition to that, we also have a lot of later works or later Jewish works which refer to this as an entity, as being like a demon. And one way that this could be broken down, especially if you rearranged the spelling slightly, is it could be read as one who is opposing El, one who is opposing God, Elohim. And in some of these later works, like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Hanok, the Book of the Watchers, as it's also called, that there are references to this being some type of being or fallen angel or something of that sort. And there are works which refer to it being bound and sent into the desert and basically put in a desert prison, buried in the desert, and then later it's going to be brought back out and given the final judgment. And that definitely seemed to be kind of like a prototype of some of the things which are said in Revelation, at least from my opinion. And so the underlying question behind this might be, well, is this just entirely later? Is this just an idea which is entirely later, or is this hinting at something which was an idea at the time? So that is something that we discussed, and I don't have a strong opinion on it. At one time, I probably needed it to be one way, but I don't really have a strong opinion on it. I can definitely see how it could easily just be departing goat or goat which is removed. And one idea which also was brought up is in reference to the next chapter, because we have this next chapter talking about how the people had been sacrificing to the Seirim or Seirim. And what are these things? Of course, it's translated as demons or devils in a lot of translations. And so what is this? It's the same word, or appears to be the same word, referring to a certain type of goat. And so there is often this connection or assumption that maybe it's a goat demon or some type of other Elohim. And also in my reading, there are suggestions that maybe it's talking about rain or storm Elohim of some sort. And one of the questions that was raised is there a connection between what's going on here and what's going on in the preceding chapter? And of course, that's not entirely clear. It's certainly not explicit. It is an interesting connection, And of course, as we know, not everything in the Torah is laid out exactly chronologically, but it was an interesting idea at least. So those are some of the things that we talked about in our last two meetings. This is something we're doing on a regular basis every Shabbat. And if you might be interested in that, I have a previous video where I talk about everything you need to know about it. It talks about when we're doing it, and it talks about some of the expectations I have for the group as we are doing it. And also, it's the similar expectation that I'm expecting with regard to the Sukkot meeting, which I am scheduling for the observance of the Day of Assembly and also the preceding days for the days of Sukkot. There's going to be a Sukkot event, which I am hosting. I put out a video on that a few weeks ago alongside the video regarding the meeting. And so if you're interested in any of those, check that out, and there will be more information coming soon. I'm still working on the study regarding the day, and I'm also doing other study regarding the calendar, and I will be putting that out whenever the time is right, whenever I am at the point I feel like it's good to share. So thanks for listening. Guard the commands, stay focused, and be tenacious.